It is December 14th, 2024, and it has been nearly 1 week since Bashar al-Assad was overthrown in Syria. There are still countless questions as to exactly what happened. Why did everything fall apart so quickly? And was there any kind of deal made behind the scenes? And as we're seeing right now, there are a number of countries who are taking advantage of the absence of Assad. You have Israel bombing Syria, unleashing a free for all in its latest land grab, occupying more and more Syrian territory and basically doing whatever they want with the Syrian border. Then you have Turkey with eyes on pipeline plans, as well as continuing to think that they can control the latest rebrand of Al-Qaeda that is now taking power in this transitional government. So, what does all of this mean for the country? Well, we had the opportunity to speak earlier with an independent journalist who lived in Damascus, who was forced to evacuate as you had violence and chaos sweeping the nation's capital. We were able to talk to her about her story and about how all of this happened. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is independent journalist Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
No, you're welcome.
I'm glad that I get to talk to you. I know it has been an incredibly rough week. You were based in Damascus, but of course, the sudden overthrow of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad last week and the Al-Qaeda fueled violence that followed. Because of all of that, you had to evacuate. Will you start by taking me through what that experience was like and what the moment was like when you knew that you were no longer safe?
Well, I mean, as I've been saying in a lot of interviews, that basically there was a lot of confusion. Like I was getting messages the day before that I had to leave, and then I was being told, no, everything was okay, stand down. There's going to be one of the lines I was being told was there's going to be a ceasefire in about 8 hours, and so therefore all of the attacks will end. And at that point, there were statements being put out that President Assad would stay for 6 months and he would be part of the transitional process to the new government in Syria and so on. So there were very mixed messages going on at that point, right? So I didn't leave on the Saturday. I didn't leave until the Sunday morning. But on the Saturday night, it basically became apparent that the armed groups had advanced from Homs towards Damascus, which is normally about 2 hours drive, to the western suburbs of Damascus, which is where I was living. And I can't remember what time at night, but let's say 10 o'clock at night, we started to hear the celebratory gunfire, and we knew that at least some armed elements were inside the suburb where I was living. Israel started then bombing the air defense bases around me with bunker buster bombs. So the whole house was shaking. So we understood exactly what had been going on in Gaza and Lebanon for the last more than 1 year. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I waited out the night. In the morning, they tried to actually enter where I was living. So they were battering on the door and I managed to yell at them. The dogs were barking, so they went away. But they were looting all of the houses where I was living, because many people had evacuated the day before and gone to safer areas, particularly on the coast, for example, or they'd gone to Lebanon. And of course, in Syria, as I keep saying, there's no electricity, right? So most of this was in darkness all through the night. We didn't know where they were positioned. And these weren't really the HTS militia. These were sort of armed thugs and criminals that came in from the surrounding areas to take advantage of the fact that HTS were about to march into Damascus. And so, as I said, they were mainly looters and thieves and people coming just on an opportunist whim to take the cars and steal whatever they could that wasn't nailed down. And then so after they tried to get into the house, we'd been speaking to drivers and so on and so forth. So then my driver came, took me to the Syrian border, which was teeming with the armed groups again, just looting the duty-free, looting all of the shops, all of the houses in the area around the border. And I was extremely lucky. My driver was really kind of brave, to be honest, because he just rammed his way through them. I then picked up the Lebanon side driver in the middle of the two borders, and then got through into Lebanon. So, it wasn't particularly stressful. Once you're dealing with it, you're dealing with it. But, the worrying thing is that the people who remain behind in Syria are terrified, because all the areas are now occupied. HTS is talking about dividing Damascus into sectors and going house to house, searching for obviously any evidence that they supported the government, and so on. So, we know that there are ethnic cleansing pogroms ongoing in the minority sect areas, particularly on the coastal areas and in Homs. So there is an atmosphere of fear right now. Of course, that's not being shown to you by Western media outlets at all.
Yeah, I want to say it was shocking to me that they came in and they said, "Oh, HTS, this rebranded version of Al-Qaeda, they're moderate and diversity friendly." But as soon as I saw that, I knew, oh, this is not going to be good, right? As soon as the media attention turns to trying to whitewash this group, while you know that there are going to be atrocities committed on the ground. I know we've seen some videos on social media, but that's likely just kind of the beginning of it, which is just incredibly disheartening for the people of Syria. As you noted, I mean, living there, being able to live in the country. I know from the outside, it did seem very shocking that it was like, oh, Assad, he was there for all of these years and now it's just over, right? Everything has just collapsed so quickly. What was that like, seeing it from the inside? I know you were mentioning, there was talk of a possible ceasefire. Did it seem as though this all could come to an end, or was that kind of the shocking part, that it was like, all right, that's it, we're, the Syrian army is now standing down, there is no fight, and it's over?
Yeah, I mean, of course it was shocking, because, having followed the regime change war against Syria really since 2013, but I first came to Syria in 2016, and having seen the courage of the Syrian army, despite having, far less capability from a weapons perspective, from an equipment perspective, than the very well-equipped and well-armed terrorist factions, including ISIS, that were backed by multiple NATO member states and by Israel, and the Gulf states, and heavily funded. But we saw them liberate still vast swaths of Syrian territory, and that was testament to their bravery. But of course, that was 14 years ago. Since 2020, a number of those soldiers were decommissioned and sent home. The new conscripts haven't had the battle experience that the former comrades had. And to be fair, I know everybody is painting it as a kind of universal surrender by the Syrian Arab Army, but actually that's not correct. There were elements that kept fighting, and to some degree were kind of abandoned, particularly in Aleppo in the beginning. Abandoned not only by their own forces, but by Russia as well. And then tried to keep fighting, heading towards Hamar, and again were pretty much abandoned. So that's what I'm saying. There was huge amounts of confusion, because particularly on the Aleppo situation, we knew that sleeping cells had been triggered inside Aleppo to produce these kind of propaganda videos of them marauding into the city and taking control. But in the beginning, it was a very small number. There were breaches, as far as I can understand, in security. There was a lack of communication between the command and the actual soldiers on the ground. There were also stories that there were jamming operations against the communications, so they weren't able to communicate. Right. So all of this, information was coming in from all different areas. And yeah, it was incredibly difficult to keep up with it. And really, until they came to they came to Homs, and then we knew that Hezbollah and Iran and some of the Syrian army factions were going to make a stand, because Homs was, or is, pivotal to Hezbollah because it's on the border of Lebanon at al-Qusayr. It's where many of the supply lines go through to resupply Hezbollah with weapons, both from outside Syria but also manufactured inside Syria. And then once we heard that the overwhelming forces had pushed through in Homs, we kind of knew that, well, that's it. Like, it's Damascus next, because there's nothing standing in their way. And at that point, we realized that even in Damascus, they were going to surrender at that point, which to some degree prevented greater bloodshed. You know, I do understand that as a policy, because allowing them to enter, to take the weapons from the soldiers and the uniforms and tell them to go home, which is what we saw in Damascus. But now, of course, come the reprisals. And that's what we're seeing across the country, not only in the coastal towns and in Homs, but also even in Damascus. We're hearing stories of extrajudiciary executions of what are described as Assad henchmen, but without, of course, providing any proof that they're Assad henchmen, and, you know, or going through any kind of legitimate trial process, and being supported by mainstream media. I mean, I watched Jeremy Bowen of the BBC literally relishing the idea that the crowd were rushing off to watch an execution, with no condemnation of this behavior. You know, it was just, it's monstrous, actually, what they're now doing. They're picking up the narratives that they kind of lost control of, really, from 2016 onwards, when Aleppo was liberated. They're picking up the same narratives now and just running with them again, because they know that there's no obstacles in their way. There's no one on the ground to actually say, no, like, that's fake, that's fake. I mean,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, that's the crazy part about it. I know that this week we had CNN, they had that ridiculous video with Clarissa Ward where she's acting like she went into a prison and found the last prisoner who was apparently there for 5 days and had no idea, and then you pull him out into the light. He's looking at the sun, completely, well manicured hands. And I'm going, okay, but as you noted, when you don't have any, not even countering media, but when you don't have any alternatives on the ground who are able to be there safely and to note that, hey, this is what is actually going on, then you do have CNN just marching in and saying, hey, we are going to control the narrative. That's exactly what the US wants them to do. But going back to what you were saying about Syria's allies, I mean, part of the reason that we, got the liberation of Aleppo, right, that we had Assad still in power, was the fact that you had Russia coming in and you had support from Hezbollah and Iran. And I noticed when it came to the HTS offensive and when that really kicked off, the first thing that the Biden administration said was, well, Syria's allies are busy right now and they're quote unquote weakened and they've got other conflicts going on, all of which are related or can be tied back to the US and Israel. But how do you view the response from those allies like Russia and like Iran? Did they give up essentially and say it's not worth the fight? Did they have, their hands tied in some ways, or is there still a lot that we don't know and, hopefully we'll find out about what happened?
Well, based on the facts that I know from on the ground, since the whole kind of operation began, which was literally only 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I mean, if you told me 2 weeks ago that this was going to happen, I'd have just laughed, to be honest, because it just seemed so impossible. But so therefore that leads me to the conclusion that something must have gone on, that and I was talking with friends here during the whole operation, and we kept saying there's something we're not getting, there's something gone on. And eventually, you have to conclude that deals were made. And my opinion, based on Russia's reactions and the fact that Russia actually abandoned one of the Syrian army brigades to the east of Aleppo, left them completely and went back to Hamameim, And in fact, I think it was Iranian reinforcements that were coming into the east of Aleppo that saw them leaving and said, "Where are you going?" And they were like, "No, we're back to base. We're not staying here." I think, honestly, when Trump was obviously going to be re-elected, just as happened in 2016, everyone started thinking, okay, we can get a deal with Trump. And Trump's, one of his kind of candidacy campaigns was ending the war in Ukraine. And this was getting blown out of all proportion. You know, he's going to stop nuclear war in Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. So it was very important for him to actually achieve something in Ukraine. And I think there were back-channel conversations, negotiations between the incoming Trump administration and Moscow. And I think pretty much they had expended as much as they wanted to in Syria. They saw the extent of the onslaught that was coming because HTS and all of the different foreign mercenary factions and terrorist factions had 5 years in Idlib under the Turkish-Russian ceasefire to prepare. And they'd had Ukrainian special forces coming in to train them and to give them drone technology on top of Turkey, having been doing that for a number of years also. And I think Russia thought, okay, we'll do a deal on Ukraine and we'll relinquish our, let's say, influence in Syria, and Assad will have to step down. And so I think, obviously, it's going to be some time before the real minutiae come out in this, but it seems very apparent to me that something had gone on, because only a few weeks ago, Assad was at the Arab League summit shaming the Gulf states over their lack of reaction to prevent the genocide in Palestine. That's the President Assad that we know, right, who's completely consistent and dedicated to his causes, to his vision for the future of Syria and so on. And he's been consistent, whatever you think about him. If you go back and read his speeches from 2011 until now, they've been consistent. He's never deviated. So why would he suddenly deviate now unless he's forced into a position where he has no choice? And I think that was almost certainly the situation. And I think Russia would be the one to do that, basically. So, and of course, for Turkey and Qatar, so this was an operation by Israel, the US, Turkey, and Qatar. And right now, Turkey and Qatar are meeting in Damascus, of course, to talk about the pipeline that runs from Qatar through Turkey to Europe, that was backed by the United States, that was turned down by President Assad back in 2009 in favor of the Iranian-Russian pipeline. And that led basically to the ignition of the regime change war against Syria, amongst other factors, of course. So, you know, when we're watching everything roll out, then it becomes even more apparent that I think a deal was made. And we're seeing now, of course, Russia's negotiating with HTS to maintain its base at Hmeimim, but we're also being told that they're moving cargo planes to Libya, where Russia has been building up its military forces for some time. So it would also make sense that it's not really going to be tenable to keep a military base for very long in a country controlled by Turkey, the US, Israel, and all other kind of interested players. But in Libya, potentially they can, because they've kind of already made inroads there militarily and economically.
Wow. And I just, watching this play out, and as you're saying it there, I'm like, yeah, it when you look at it, you're going, okay, there had to be a deal somewhere, right? It doesn't just happen this clean cut where it's, Assad hops on a plane, goes to Russia, and then the statements from Russia are, hey, Assad chose this, and we, they didn't come out with any major condemnation, which I feel like they normally would have, but it still does add to the shock of it, given everything that Russia has done and poured into Syria. It's like for them just to kind of go, okay, we're done now and we're moving on to the next thing. Now, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the continued foreign involvement in Syria, specifically coming from Israel, because as we saw, Israel wasted absolutely no time. I mean, within a matter of hours, they're bombing Syria, they're expanding their occupation further into the Golan Heights, taking more and more land and claiming that it's just about defending themselves, as if HTS, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, whatever is ever going to attack Israel. That'll be an interesting day if they ever do. I don't expect to see it. But how do you view Israel standing in this situation? I mean, I feel like the region at some point has to realize Israel's not going to stop. They're going to continue on with as much of a land grab, as much of a continued war as they can get. Someone has to step in and stop them. And they just took out a major player in the region who was not only standing in the way, but also was crucial to the axis of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they've basically destroyed the main link in the resistance chain. So they've temporarily, at least, disabled the resistance axis. That doesn't mean, of course, that solutions aren't going to be found. But of course, if we look at what Israel has done, of course, Palestine was always isolated, but now it's pretty much destroyed since they knew Trump had been elected. And even before his inauguration, they were saying, well, that's it. Now we can annex the whole of the West Bank. We know that Netanyahu's vision is for the Indian Middle East Economic Corridor to pass through from Mumbai to the Gulf states, through the Palestinian occupied territories, Gaza, into Egypt, and then to Europe. So for them, that's their vision pretty much achieved largely, and Palestinians will be potentially from Gaza shipped into Jordan. So we might see pressure now being put onto Jordan in order to force them to accept an exodus from Gaza, leaving behind only the ones that will relinquish resistance and continue living in kind of reduced down concentration camps within a concentration camp, which will then become a free trade zone as part of the EEC, right? And then we saw exactly the same scenario in Lebanon, and where they destroyed much of the north, and they bombed the southern suburbs of Beirut into kind of the Stone Ages, really. I mean, it's being rebuilt now during the ceasefire. And at that point, it became very obvious why Netanyahu had accepted the ceasefire, was so that he could pivot to Syria. And of course, we were all kind of expecting Israeli bombing, right? That's what we thought was going to come, and a limited attack in the northwest. I think very few people had actually envisaged what we saw unroll over the next 10 days on behalf of Israel, of course. And you're right, almost immediately during the reign or the presidency of President Assad, we never saw Israel dare encroach on Syrian territory beyond the occupied Golan territories. We never saw them able to use bunker buster bombs in Syria, because the air defense would have intercepted them and would have intercepted the planes coming into Syrian airspace, because the missiles were always fired from almost always external to Syria, unless they were using friendly airspace like the US bases. And so, at that point, at the ceasefire, when they'd kind of achieved what they wanted in Lebanon, and they were going to pivot, but then the HTS advance, and not only the HTS, but the Free Syrian Army, or the Syrian National Army advance on behalf of Turkey from the north, not the northwest, it became very clear that Israel was managing events in order to take control of the south, which they'd been also talking about for some time, advance to within 20 kilometers of Damascus, potentially take control of the biggest border between Lebanon and Syria, in order to prevent, again, the resupply to Hezbollah from inside Syria. So what have they done? They've effectively isolated Palestine from the resistance axis. They've isolated Hezbollah in Lebanon from the resistance axis. They're isolating Syria from the resistance axis on both borders. And in my opinion, they'll create another surveillance belt up the southeastern border and the northeastern border, shut the Al-Bukamal border, which is the main entrance for any convoys coming from Iran and Iraq. And now they're starting ISIS operations inside Iraq against the resistance factions there. So it seems to be this pattern of isolation of each link in the resistance chain to move on. And of course, if they manage to make inroads in Iraq through the resistance forces, then they'll be on the border with Iran. And not only that, but now they have the use of Syrian territory to launch attacks against Iran.
Yeah, it's just, I know for the last few years we've talked about this growing multipolar world, right? And all of the advances that have been made by countries around the world that are taking on US hegemony. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how many steps back were taken in the last 2 weeks. And they need to realize that if we want to talk about this growing multipolar world, you are going to have to talk about holding Israel accountable for its crimes, which continue on, in which so many countries around the world have allowed to continue on as they've watched Israel carry out genocide for over a year now. So it's like, what more are they going to do? Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to share your story and to also break down and explain all of the latest here. Independent journalist Vanessa Beeley, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you for having me on, Rachel. Appreciate it.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanction. You can also catch Sanction over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.